Good morning, Morai Verabotai, Bruchim Abayim. We are continuing on Masechet Succah, and we are on the bottom of Daf Memchet, Amud Aleph, 7 lines up from the bottom of the Amud, by the Mishnah, the last Mishnah of the Amud. Today's Amud is being learned as a zchut for the Refuah Shlema of Rachel bat Edna, Rachel Simcha bat Nahid, Michael ben Nahid, Esther Bracha bat Chaya, Rabbi Abraham ben Tashgol, all Refuah Shlema b'toch Shar Cholei Yisrael. Amen. This Amud is also being learned Leilui Nishmat Jacqueline bat Abraham v'Agdas. This week's learning of the community has been dedicated by Shea family, Dayan family, and Cohen families. It should be an ultimate zchut for all of their mishpachot. Be'ezrat Hashem, Amen. So before we start the new Mishnah, just one honorable mention that we left off and we promised we're going to speak about in today's Amud is the fact that they would actually make sure at the end of their experience of the Chag now in Eretz Yisrael would be completely done with Chag HaSukkot by Shvi Shel Chag and going to Shmini Atzeret, and by Chutz La'aretz. The Gemara spoke about how that affects it, but the question is, why do you have to make the Sukkah Pasul? Now, obviously you could deal with the halachic things of Stira B'Yom Tov and so on and so forth. For instance, the Rimul Lunil lights, that they weren't exactly taking off and making the whole thing of oil Pasul necessarily, but they would be putting, taking Schach Kasher, putting Schach Pasul instead, and that's how he explains the 4 Tfachim instead of 3 that we asked, which is really the question of Tosafot on Rashi that we mentioned yesterday. But writes the Rambam. This is again, you have to understand why they have to go out of Sukkah and make the Sukkah Pasul. Just go out of the Sukkah. Why? Moving into the house. Moving into the house, I could just eat my Seudah inside the house and let the Sukkah be. Why do you have to go ahead and passel up the Sukkah in order to show that today is not Chag HaSukkot no longer? Now, obviously, in the Mefashim that we spoke about, we're talking about the mitzvah of Bal Tosif. A person can't have extra mitzvah from what it says in the Torah when the Torah defines the limitations. So if the Torah says Chag HaSukkot ta'aseh lecha shivat yamim, and I say, you know what, I love this mitzvah so much, I'm going to do Sukkah 8 days, right? That's not a good thing. That's Bal Tosif. If you go inside and say, oh, I'm doing mitzvah Sukkah, I'm going to do it 8 days. I'm so from, right? So it's going to be Averah, not Bal Tosif, right? Therefore, you have to make sure that the Sukkah is Pasul. This way you're not doing Bal Tosif. But just go inside. Why do you have to bother yourself with parceling up the Sukkah? Now, some of the Mefarshim write that this is because, talking about the case that you don't have a different place to eat. This is your place. The only place that you can be eating for whatever reason is the Sukkah. So if the only place you can eat is in the Sukkah, then you have to parcel it up to show that it's not a kosher Sukkah that you're trying to sit in for an extra day. But Rambam does not write that. When Rambam talks about this, and I read to you, the Lashon of the Rambam in Perek Vav, the Halachot HaSukkah, is that he brings all of these halachot, and he doesn't say a thing about Mishen lo makom acher lechol rak besukkah. He just says you have to parcel it up, and in Reb Chaim, Briskerov, Briskerov's father, Chaim, he's medayek in the Rambam, that you see from Rambam that even if you're eating inside the house, because you're taking the kelim inside, so obviously you're eating inside the house, you still have to parcel up the sukkah, because you want to show medayek hagrach, the Rambam sover she'af im hu ochel bebayit tzarich la'asot heker. This I found in Daf al Daf on our Masechta from Rabbi Klein, Rabbi Klein, and he says, he brings the Rab Chaim that says from the Rambam, you see that even if you're going to be eating in the house, you still have to pass it up the sukkah. Why? You're not going to even see the sukkah. So it says the Grach, because you have to make a heker, sarich lasot heker shenigmara mitzvah shel sukkah. You have to make a heker that the mitzvah of sukkah is done with. V'chilshono, the language that he uses is kedel azkir shehi psula v'shkvar nigmara mitzvata. To show everyone that it's pasul now, and we're putting an end to the mitzvah of sukkah. Now this, the reason I'm bringing it is because we just came out of Chag Pesach, right? And we have a minhag, the Sfaradim, the Persians have it, the Syrians are not fully sure, but Moroccans for sure, it's a big thing by them, they call it the Chag Mimuna, right? What's Mimuna? Motzai Pesach, they go make sure to eat chametz, right? Persians have the same thing. It causes a lot of problems because for the less educated, that you have to, you have to be careful not to purchase it too early during Pesach and so on and so forth. And even for the more sophisticated questions, because chametz is asur ba'ana'ah, you can't, as a store owner, for instance, that wants to make pizza, you can't keep dough, right, and sell it even if you're reliant on mechirat chametz, because you want to save yourself from the hour and a half, 2 hours in Motzei Chag to make a fresh dough, because that would be a rotzeh bekiyumo question, right? If you have something that is asur b'hana'ah, even if it's not yours, technically in the technical term because you saw, but you want it to be there because right away, immediately after Pesach, you want to use it, that becomes a potential halachic problem. So again, that's for everyone to ask their private questions from their Moreh Ora'ah. But nevertheless, where does that minhag come from? The minhag comes from the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon used to make sure that he ate chametz on Motzei Chag, right? He made sure to eat Motzei, and says Rab Chaim Brisker, he says from here you have a makor for the minhag of the Vilna Gaon. From our Gemara, you have and the Rambam, the way Rambam learns the Gemara, you have a proof for the minhag of the Vilna Gaon that on Motzei Pesach, shaya mishtadel b'Motzei Pesach le'echol chametz. He would try his best to actually have chametz. Back in the day, it was much harder because stores open. Motzei Pesach, you had to go make your chametz from scratch, right? So he was mishtadel to eat chametz on Motzei Pesach, to show this very thing. Vaya nimna lachar Pesach lechor matzah. He would refrain from eating matzah after Pesach. He wanted to show that it's cut off, right? Where does that come from? Comes from our Gemara says, Reb Chaim Brisker. So that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. It says Shitat Rambam. If you understand the Rambam like that, Rambam learned, according to the Grach, Rambam learned our sugya, our Gemara like this, despite the fact that you're going inside and eating your Suda, and you have nothing to do with this sukkah, you still have to pass it up the sukkah in order to show that Chag HaSukkot is finished. We're no longer keeping an extra day of Chag HaSukkot. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of the Grach. So it says,
I'm sorry, the 8 day of Sukkot, Chutz Haaretz doesn't apply, right? Because you have a doubt it could be, and so you don't have to pass on the
exactly. That's why we mentioned that whether you go out according to Rabbi Shimon Levi or the other shittas, either bring a ner, right, to show that I am not doing it because of the mitzvah, or you leave in the dirty plates that you usually would right away take out of the sukkah. You want to show that this is not this is not a mitzvah of sukkah, but at the same time,
you don't want to pass on the sukkah.
At night I need to still sit in the sukkah, even though that's Shemini Atzeret, but Safek Shvi'i, so therefore you don't want your sukkah to be rendered invalid. But again, the same thing would be in nowadays. Actually, this is very relevant because many shuls, they have a Seudah for Simchat Torah. Right? People, just the practicalities of going home, not going home, and people are not eating anything, and so on. So many times you have food set up, where are you going to have it? The yard of the shul is all made into a sukkah. So you're going to have a seudah of Simchat Torah night or day, and you want to have it in the shul for people to be able to dance in the shul and to be sameach with the Torah. And the seudah you're going to have in the sukkah. Well, according to everyone in Chutz La'aretz, the ninth day already is not sukkah. So that would be the same exact thing. You can't necessarily, we had this question 2 years ago, for those who remember, and we parceled up the sukkah in a way that will be clear for everyone that enters it because of our Mishnah over here. So says the Gemara, Nisuch hamayim ketzad. So we go one by one, we're going through all of the elements that we have had in our original Mishnah. Now the Gemara says, how do you do in Nisuch hamayim? Slochit shel zahav machazeket shelosha logim haya memale min hashiloach. They had a special golden jug that would fit 3 logim. 3 logim, according to Tanakama, is the minimum amount of nisuch that you need for a korban. So this is again revi'it hahin, right? A log is revi'it hahin because every 3 logim is revi'it hahin because every hin is 12 login. So revi'it hahin is the amount of nisuch for the minimum amount of nisuch, so that they would take this jug of gold and they would go to shiloach. Why shiloach? Because it has to be, really the water has to be from a mayan. There are other reasons for it as well, but it says ushaftem mayim besason mimayene hayeshua. So it has to be from mayan. The shiloach was a mayan that was next to the area of the Beit HaMikdash, so they would go there. Hegiu le'shar hamayim, and they're coming back, and this was a big tararam in the Beit HaMikdash. Every night they had the Simchat Beit HaShoeva because of this, right? Ushaftem mayim besason. It has to be with happiness. Therefore, the way they would do it is when they got to Sha'ar Hamayim, and therefore you have to understand that Sha'ar Hamayim was one of the gates of the Beit HaMikdash, and it's called Sha'ar Hamayim because of this. Because 7/8 days of the year, they would bring the Mayim for Nisuch HaMayim. Right? There is no other day of the year that has Nisuch HaMayim. Every Korban every day has Nisuch HaYayin by Tamid Shel Shachar, right? You have Nisuch HaYayin, but not Nisuch HaMayim. Nisuch HaMayim is only Chag HaSukkot, and according to Rabbi Yehuda is also Shmini Atzeret. So as for that 7/8 days, this Sha'ar is named Sha'ar Hamayim. So they would come to Sha'ar Hamayim, Taku ve'iriu v'taku, they would start blowing shofarot, right, as a sign of simcha, again, because Ushaftem mayim besason, this was a tremendous simcha. And then it would go, ala bakevesh, upana lesmolo, it would go up the ramp of the Mizbeach, Kohen would go up, upana lesmolo, it would turn left, because he has to end up with the Keren Deromit Maravit, the southwestern corner of the Mizbeach, had a hole that would go down like completely through the Mizbeach and through the ground until very deep down. It was the place that they poured all of the Nesachim into that hole that we're going to learn about, and this would go down to the Tehom beneath the Mizbeach. So says the Gemara, so the Mishnah. Shnei sfalim shel kesef hayusham. There were 2 pails made out of kesef, out of silver, that were there. Stationary, so to speak, right? They're stationary, sitting on top of Mizbeach, and they each had a spout that would, everything that you poured inside them, right? It would go from the spout into the hole on the Mizbeach, right? So says the Mishnah, Shnei sfalim shel kesef hayusham. Rabbi Yehuda holds they were not shel kesef, they were shel sid, but they looked like kesef because of the usage. They became darkened, and it had like a silver touch to it, so to speak. Ela shayu mushcharin penehem mipenei hayayin umenukavin, and they had a hole. Each one of them had a spout, kemin shne chotamin dakin, like two chotems, the nose, they had like a spout coming out that will pour out whatever you poured inside of them out. Echad me'ube ve'echad dak. One of them was a larger hole, a larger spout, and the other one was slightly smaller. Why? Because the consistency of wine and water is very different, right? Wine has a thicker consistency, and therefore it takes longer for it to come out. You have a little bit of a larger hole for that. This way, it was the beauty of it, that they were finished together. When you would put the shlosha login, it would complete the process exactly together. This was like the beauty of the nisuch hamayim and nisuch hayayin. So therefore, one of them was more me'ube. It was larger than the other one. In order for both of them to finish at the same exact time. Now we're going to discuss the details of this. So it says, this is all the Mishnah for now. It says the Mishnah, Ma'aravo shel ma'im, mizracho shel yayin. The one that was towards the Kodesh and Kodesh Kodashim side of Ma'arav was the one of water, and the other one closer to the body of the Mizbeach, which was in the Mizrach, would be the sefel, the pail that was made for yayin. Ira shel mayim letoch shel yayin, v'shel yayin letoch shel mayim yatsa. If you by mistake poured the water into the pail of wine, or vice versa, you're yotze. So the Mizrach, Ma'arav, fine, but if you b'di'evet mix them up, that would be still fine. So says the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Belo gaya menasech kol shemona. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Tarakama on two elements. A, it says it was not shlosha login, it was only log echad, by 1/3. B, he holds that it was not 7 days, but it was 8 days. Right? Shmini Atzeret also was part and parcel of this process, this mitzvah. Says the Mishnah, Ul menasech omer, and the person in charge down there would say to the menasech, again, remember, the one that's pouring, the menasech is on top of the mizbeach, right? So you have to have complete sight of what he's doing exactly. So they would tell him, Hagba yadecha, raise your hand as you pour it, because we want to know where you're pouring this. Why? Why would we do that? Because, says the Mishnah, Shepam Achat, one time, the guy that had gotten the kibud of going up and doing the Nisuch Hayayin and Nisuch Hamayim, right, was a Saduki. Sadukim were a big problem in Beit Sheni, and they were powerful, and we didn't know who was a Saduki. This becomes a whole Yuma sugya over here. In Masechet Yuma, we have at length a discussion of how they would try to make sure to determine if the person is a real, legitimate Kohen, or is a Kohen that's Tzeduki in his heart. Because many of the Tzedukim, they were afraid of the Chachamim, and they would hide their real identity and real belief in their hearts. Right? The Gemara there talks about the machloket that they had, Tzedukim and the Prushim and Chachamim, for the Ktoret going on Yom Kippurim inside the Kodesh HaKodashim. When do you put the Ktoret on the Esh? Outside, inside, right? And it says this guy that became the Kohen Gadol you're talking about was a Tzeduki, and he did this. And he was so excited that he got to do it the way of the Tzedukim, and obviously he died that year, and the worms were coming out of his nose because it says Yasimu Ketorah Ba'apecha. He messed up with Ketoret, and so. But this just goes to show you that this was a major problem in the time of Beit Sheni. That Tzedukim were a major problem. So therefore, we want to make sure, like even though that we hope and we know that we think we know the person, right? But it's very hard to know, really know the person. So therefore, we will tell him Hakba Yadecha. We want to see exactly what you're doing. Why? Because it was a story that happened. The guy one time, the Kohen that got this kibbud was a Tzeduki, And the Snukim don't believe in Nisuch Hamayim. That's one of the things they don't believe in. And what they did was, he poured it into the pail of water, he poured it on his feet, on top of the Mizbeach, right? Says, the Mishnah, Shepam Achat, Nasach Echad al Gaber Raglav, poured it on his feet instead of putting it in the pail of water. Urgam, and people realized it afterwards, and what they did was, they were not happy, right? And they stoned him with their etrogim, right? Right? This was again a problem between the people who were very mindful of this whole thing of the Snukim. Urgamu kolam be'etrogen. K'masu bechol kach masu b'Shabbat. The same exact thing has to be done on Shabbat as well. You have to have nisuch hamayim on Shabbat of Chol HaMoed or Yom Tov, whatever it is. And says the Mishnah, Ela shaya memale me'erev Shabbat. But there's one problem. You can't go to the Shiloach, right, and bring the water because of the Isur of Hotza'ah. It's the Shut HaRabim. So what do? You have to fill up the water already from before Shabbat. So they would fill it up bechol from Erev Shabbat, chavit shel zahav she'ena mekudeshet. They would take a chavit zahav that has not been used for avodah. Now we'll see in the Gemara later on, why do you need a chavit zahav she'ena mekudeshet? A vessel that has not been sanctified as a vessel of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, how do you sanctify, by the way, the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash? Now you had Shemen HaMishchai in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, but when you don't have Shemen HaMishchai, avodatan hi mechalechatan. When you use them, that usage of the first time really is mechanech, now they become holy. Now, what's the problem? We'll see in the Gemara, but one major problem is if you have a kli sharet and something stays in it overnight, lina is pasul, makes it pasul. So therefore, you can't have a regular keli that's mekudeshet. You have to have a new vessel that has not been used before. You'd have the golden jug that was not mekudeshet. You fill it up from the Ma'ayan, from Shiloach, umanichah belishka, and you cover it and you leave it in the lishka for tomorrow morning. From Erev Shabbat, you do it for afterwards, right? So why do you have to, by the way, cover it? So says the Mishnah, nishpecha, if it was tipped over, it fell. What do you do now, right? If it poured out, or nitkalta, or it was exposed. Someone forgot to cover it, or they took the cover off, and it stayed open, uncovered, then it becomes pasul. Why does it become pasul, by the way? Now, nishpacha, you don't have it anymore. Nitgalta, well, the problem is, water that has been exposed, we are concerned that there was a creature that came, a snake or came that and drank from it and put some venom inside. Now, why is that the problem? So if you look at Rashi, the problem perhaps is because you need exact 3 logim of water. Say if you drank some and put a little eres, little venom there, so you don't have exact measurements. But the Tosafot and others, they are not necessarily happy with that. They say it's not necessarily because of the shiur, even if you have shiur. It's not respectful, right? It's not respectful, something that you wouldn't drink because it's dangerous, because there's a chashash of a steak having put something inside there. You wouldn't drink it yourself. You should not be bringing that to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Like the Pasuk says, the Pasuk complains about Jews bringing korbanot that were not befitting the kavod of the Beit HaMikdash. I said, when you bring a lame animal, a blind animal, a blemished animal, it's not ugly, right? It says, the Pasuk says, bring it to your chashuv people, to the important officials, as a gift. Is he going to be happy with you? Is he going to accept it even? Right? So says you can't bring that type of thing to the Mikdash. By the way, this was conceptually, we have to realize that Cain and Hevel who brought korbanot, the first people who brought korbanot, Cain was the one that invented the concept of korban. The very first person, right, perhaps, that brought, Adam Arishon discussion aside, when that was and so on, but the first person that invented, created the concept of korbanot, of bringing something of your own to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, was Cain. He was an innovative person, right? He built cities, he created concepts, right? And his kids also, you see, this is not a discussion for now, but the Cain comes from Kaniti, Ishalakim, it's a lashon of kinyan and acquirements and building and infrastructure and so on and so forth. That's Cain. Hevel merely copied the concept from Cain. So why was Hevel accepted, Cain not accepted? Because Cain conceptually came up with the idea, but he said, well, it's a concept that matters. I'm giving something to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it's a waste of things, burning. So I'm just going to get the things that are lower qualities, because the main thing is that conceptually you are connecting with Hashem in that way. Hevel said, no. If you're already kvar, if you're already bringing, you have to bring the best. What do you give to Hashem? Correct, it's going to be all burning, right? But it's not a waste, because you're connecting with Hashem. You have to do it the best way. You're doing something for Hashem, it has to be the best way. And that became the ideological difference between Cain and Hevel, and obviously we know what happened at the end of that, and that's the same thing. Here you cannot bring a water that is not perfect for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore, if it was nitkalta, if the quality went down because now there is a chashash, maybe a steak went and used it and drank from it or whatnot, you're not going to be using it. So what happens now if it's pasul? It's Shabbat morning. You can't go back to Shiloach anymore because of Hotzah. So what do? You're stuck? Says the Mishnah, you would do it from the kior. Now, kior was the water that was used by the Kohanim for Kiddush Raglaim, and that kior was not pasul because of lina, because they had a whole system of lowering the entire tank of water, which was kior, into a bore, into a water source inside the area of the Chaser HaMikdash, with a chain and a whole lever and a whole process. Because if you leave it, again, the water will become inside the kior, and kior is a vessel that was nitkadesh, and water that would stay there overnight would become pasul. So every day before night, when the avodah b'Tamid was done with, they would lower the kior inside the source of water, the entire kior, a large vessel, it will be lowered with ropes and chains inside this, and then tomorrow morning it will be brought back up to be used for Kiddush. So there you could use that water for Nisuch Hamayim. As well, Shayayin Ramayim Megulin Pesulim Legabe Mizbeach. And water or wine that was left open is pasul to be brought on top of the Mizbeach. So that basically is our Mishnah of how do we deal with Nisuch Hamayim, how many days you had it, where do you get the water from, and how the process was. Now, says the Gemara, I realize we're out of time, but just a little beginning of the Gemara. We'll probably go back to this. Menanamili. How do we know that it had to be with the whole tararam of blowing shofarot and the simcha and so on and so forth, when you have the shrivat hamayim of Nisuch Hamayim? Says the Gemara, Amar Rabina, the Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Ushaftem mayim b'sason mimayna Yeshua. It has to be with sason. It has to be with rejoicing and simcha. Therefore, we accompany it with kleshir, with blowing of the shofarot and musical instruments of such nature. Hanao teremini. Now, this is a beginning of a very, very interesting and insightful, deep, agadic Gemara story. The Gemara says there were two minim, right? The non-believer Jews, right? And one of their names was Sason, and the other name was Simcha. So this is a pretty interesting. You can already tell that this is going to be a very interesting story in the Gemara. And what happened to them, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll learn tomorrow morning in our next shiur.
Great cliffhanger.